I'm with Tamar Tailor. Now, you've received an MA in Holocaust Studies from Haifa University. Why did you want to study the Holocaust?
Okay, it goes back a long way. Many years ago, when I was 16, I was a very new Christian then, and I was at a school in North London which had a lot of Jewish people attending. So my curiosity was already piqued a little bit about Jewish people and their faith. But I was studying history for my A levels, and I went into the school library and just saw this word, Holocaust. And believe it or not, at that time, it really wasn't talked about. I just picked out a book, and the first book I read was Elie Wiesel Night, which I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's his story as a boy being in Auschwitz. And I just wept through the whole book as a 16-year-old. I couldn't comprehend it. And I just believed then that God was doing something deep in my heart about just the horror of the Holocaust, and deeper than that, connecting me in a way to the Jewish people and then consequently to Israel. And when we came to Israel to actually do volunteer work, I saw an opportunity at Haifa University that they were offering an MA in Holocaust studies. And although in that period of time from 16-year-old up to when I saw that, I just felt I need to learn more about this. So I went for it and I got in, and it was just an amazing study time for me of really, really connecting with the whole story. And of course, consequently, meeting many, many Holocaust survivors in Israel. And that's part of what I'm doing in Israel at the moment.
Mm. Is it a very emotional subject to study?
Very emotional on one level. I love history. So it was also learning really how, just historically, the rise of Nazism, how the whole thing unfolded and became the Holocaust. And it was stages. And it's interesting because of what's going on now. You can just see some parallels, particularly with the rise of anti Semitism that's going on right now globally. So, yes, it was emotional when you heard personal stories, very, very emotional. But the historical part of it was also fantastic to learn.
Mm. One of your papers was about a man called Nicholas Winton. I've never heard of him. Can you tell us a bit about him?
Oh, my word. Okay, well, there's a film that has just been released called One Life. And if you get an opportunity to see it, I would definitely say to go and see it because you will hear his story. And it's actually pretty much an accurate portrayal of him and the work that he did. He was actually a stockbroker working in London, just living a fairly ordinary kind of life, living with his mum at the time. But he had a friend who was a very keen Labour Party member, and he had gone out to Czechoslovakia. The background of the history was that this was after the Munich Agreement, trying to appease Hitler in the beginning of 1938, going right through 1938, and ended up with the Allies, if you like, France, UK, Russia, even allowing Hitler to take over about 35% of Czechoslovakia at the time because he claimed that it was actually German land. This resulted in a massive flood of refugees into the rest of Czechoslovakia. And there were already people out there working, but this friend of Nicholas Winton said, can you come out? We're meant to be going on a skiing holiday, but can you come out and see this situation? Because it's absolutely horrendous. And they had identified lots and lots of many unaccompanied children. And then as the months went on and things were getting worse and worse for families who were anti Nazi, but particularly Jewish families, they were just fleeing from Germany, from Austria, and they were fleeing into Czechoslovakia. So Nicholas Winton, being an amazing organizer, he only spent actually 3 weeks in Prague, and he left behind an amazing team of other people there who really got together to get these children out. And in the end, he succeeded in persuading the government to allow these children in as refugees because it was quite a hard task that he had. And he managed to get families to sponsor these children. He got photographs of the children. Incredible task that he did in a very, very short time. because, as you know, by September 1939, the war started. But between March and September, he managed to get 669 children safely out of Czechoslovakia and into Britain with families that fostered them. Sadly, for most of those children who wouldn't have known at the time, most of them lost their parents in the Holocaust, so were actually orphaned. And he, after all this happened, after the war, he kept this story to himself. It never became public until he was in his 80s. And you'll see the story in the film if you go to see the film. But basically, he starts to sort out all of the papers, and his wife is saying, you need to sort all this out now. And he comes across a scrapbook, and it contains photographs of the children, it contains letters to the government. It's a whole archive, really, of his story of what he did and others did in Czechoslovakia. And cut a long story very short, he then went on to a program called That's Life through different contacts who began to hear this amazing story. He went on to a That's Life program with Esther Rantzen in the late 80s. And it's a very moving story of how when he turns around and they ask people who were the children on these transports who are now grown up with families of their own, and every single one in the audience stands up. Very moving time. And from that time on, in his 80s, of course, the story just flooded, and he actually received a knighthood eventually. He had a film made about him in Czechoslovakia. There's a statue of him with children in Prague, in the railway station where the trains left. But what I wanted to write about in my paper was to draw attention, and he always did mention that there were many other people in Czechoslovakia, Prague, that really did risk their lives to get these children onto the trains, and they accompanied them until they were forced to leave when the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia and took over the whole country. So an
Mm.
amazing story about him.
So he was a
Yeah.
real hero to the Jewish people, wasn't he? And many lives, I guess, were saved because of him.
He was an absolute hero. And many of the children spoke afterwards, after the TV program, and basically said that they had spent years trying to find the person who had helped to rescue them without success until this program came. So many of these children did actually, some of them ended up in Israel, but many of these children stayed in the UK and made lives for themselves there. And built up a lovely relationship with Nicholas Winton, who didn't actually die until he was 106.
Wow. Wow.
So, yeah,
I imagine you're really pleased they made a movie about him and what he done.
I can't believe it. And because I love Anthony Hopkins anyway, and he plays the part so well, because the greatest sorrow to him was that there was one more, I think it was the largest number of children that were about to leave, 250 children that were about to leave Prague when war broke out, and they were not allowed to leave. They sealed the borders, and we only know of one child out of that transport that survived. All the rest perished.
Wow. Wow.
So
Amazing, amazing man.
you just see that moment where he's just so emotional, and he always said that he wished he could have saved more, because there were, at one time, I think he had details of over 5,000 children that were desperately trying to leave. But even so, he has been called the British Schindler. He wasn't very comfortable with that title, but I would see very much parallels with Oscar Schindler's efforts to save the Jewish people too.
Well, tell us about the Patria ship.
Wow, well, that's another story. Okay, so during the war, as you know, and leading up to the war breaking out, the policy of the Germans at the time, particularly in Germany, because they hadn't yet invaded other countries, but they were very much in the 30s leading up to the war encouraging Jewish people just to leave, rather than, I mean, a lot were being murdered at the time, but they were really just by taking over their businesses, sacking them from employment, and really dehumanizing them as a people. They were just wanting to get them out of Germany. And taking it up to 1938, 1939, that became a flood of refugees trying to leave, not only Germany, but Austria, Czechoslovakia. And Britain at the time held the mandate for the country of Palestine, as it was known then. And they introduced a white paper, partly under pressure from the Arabs who were already in the country, who were being quite alarmed at the numbers that were coming in, But at that time, no other country in the world was willing to take Jewish people as refugees, and the doors were really closing all over the world, apart from Palestine, where the Jewish people who were in Palestine were actively trying to get as many in as possible. Britain brought in a white paper severely restricting the numbers that could come in. So this led to a clandestine organization organized by members of the Haganah and other members of Jewish organizations to bring in people that Britain looked at as illegal immigrants. So they were commissioning ships and boats, anything that they could to get people from Europe, and they crossed the Mediterranean, and most of the time were intercepted by the British Navy and brought into Haifa. And then they set up internment camps. The first one was in Atlit. It's not far south of Haifa. Don't know if you've ever been, but I recommend a visit.
Yeah, I have been
So
there.
they interned these people there. Yes, they interned these people there. So the SS Patria was actually an old French Navy ship, massive, that the British had actually confiscated after war broke out because they were afraid that Germany were going to get all of the French Navy ships after they'd invaded France. And they brought that into Haifa. And three big ships had brought over 3,500 refugees from, and actually it was Eichmann who had commissioned these ships. They left from Romania after the war had broken out. It was actually September 1940. And they left Romania, and in November they finally arrived. Obviously, they were intercepted by Haifa and brought into Haifa. They were intercepted by the British Navy. And the idea was that Atlit was becoming too full. They didn't have enough space. So the decision was made to offload all of these people, 3,600, and put them onto the Patria, a much larger ship, and send it to Mauritius, which was one of the British colonies at the time, but hundreds and hundreds, thousands of miles away. The Haganah heard of this and were trying to prevent this from happening. And they put an explosive charge onto the ship to try and disable it so that there would be delays. They would be able to try and smuggle people out of the camps, do whatever they could to stop this happening. Very tragically, the explosion actually ripped a huge hole out of the hull, and the ship sank in 20 minutes. Whilst they were loading people, there were about 1,000 already on the ship, and very tragically, about 267 people were actually reported missing, but they recovered 209 bodies of mainly refugees, some British soldiers, and it was just a great tragedy that really came about. When I first heard the story, I just felt complete remorse and shame for the policies of Britain at the time, because if they hadn't put those policies into place, then this tragedy would never have happened. And that led, in a way, to my involvement with an organisation called Repairing the Breach, which is really seeking to repair that relationship with Israel now, between Britain and Israel now. And I'm always, I suppose, I'm struck by the fact that Germany at the end of the war totally admitted and paid great reparations to people for the Holocaust and repented of it. And so far, Britain has not really said a lot about what they were doing during the Mandate period. There were a lot of very shameful acts, and if they hadn't brought in this terrible white paper, hundreds of thousands more Jewish people could have been saved from the Holocaust.
Mm. And of course, you were actually involved last year with a ceremony at Athlete, weren't you? Tell us a bit about that.
Yes, I got very involved in Athlete because during my studies, I did an internship for a year at Athlete, and I obviously learned much, much more about the stories, the ships, the hundreds of ships that were actually lost at sea as well. And people don't really know the full number of people that tried to make the journey, but with shipwrecks and storms and often very rickety boats, many perished. So there was a commemoration ceremony at which there were many still survivors, because people weren't only sent to Athlete, people were sent to Cyprus, which was a sort of British base at the time, and they made some camps there. Mauritius, they did end up sending people to Mauritius. So they and or their families, because of course, with the passage of time, many of those have died. But we've met people from the Exodus ship, people from the SS Patria, or their families, people that were either born on Cyprus or actually got sent to Mauritius. Many of them were children at the time. Heard some amazing survival stories from the Patria, particularly one little baby who was actually born on one of the ships that was making its way to Palestine. So she was born on the ship and she was with her mother on the ship as it blew up. And mother and father lost the baby, got saved by some British soldiers, taken into Athlete camp, couldn't find the baby anywhere. And eventually the father actually went to the mortuary, found this little thing, it's like a raggedy doll almost, but recognized the clothing, and it was his little girl. And she amazingly had survived. And she now lives in the kibbutz, very close to where I live in the north. And just amazing stories like that from the Patria. So the ceremony was really for us British people. There's a small tour group that came at the time, and it was for us to really stand and say again how sorry we were as British people for the actions of the British government at the time, and do an act of repentance. We had music, we had prayers, we had statements by someone whose father had been one of the soldiers in the camp at the time. So it was a very moving ceremony, and it ended with both those who had survived or families doing a tree planting ceremony at the end of the ceremony, and we just danced and sang together, that was probably the most moving time for me, was
How
to
did
just see.
how did the people who'd been through that feel about you apologizing for what happened?
I think they find it very moving. This has been part of several ceremonies that have taken part over the years. The first one I ever went to was in 2016, and we actually met at Haifa Bay, where the ships actually came in at the Haifa port. And that was one of the largest ceremonies where because we had heard a story of how Torah scrolls were taken from these refugees as they came off the ships, because many of them had been through the Holocaust. These were survivors that were coming in after the war, and they were still being treated as illegal immigrants, and terrible things were being done to them. And one of them was that, supposedly for infection control, they took these Torah scrolls and burned them on the quayside, and often that was the only thing that people had brought with them. And so we gave each person or their family representative a Bible, and really, on a very personal note, just expressed to individuals. And it's a mixture of reactions. Some just, they hug you, or they cry a little, or they say that we weren't the ones who did it, we weren't responsible. But this is part of, it's very biblical, isn't it, about, the blessings and the curses, and what you do goes from generation to generation. And I think all of us who are part of repairing the breach are just feeling this generational responsibility, in a way, to make amends as much as we can by building up relationships with those. And of course there's a few that we have really got to know very, very well, but they themselves have these groups. They have a Cyprus group, they have an athlete group, and they often do these ceremonies themselves. And so we seek to attend them, and we lay a wreath, particularly for the SS Patria. We go to the cemetery where the bodies are buried. There's been a project to try and identify some of the people whose names were never known. So it's all part and parcel of seeking to just repair that broken relationship.
Well,
And
today
yeah.
Israel is at war. What is your prayer for the Holy Land, for Israel today, particularly with the rise in anti-Semitism that seems to be happening around the world as well?
Yeah, well, specifically for me, I think my prayer is for the return of the hostages, because I think that's an absolute agony for the people of Israel. There's just so much trauma, but the tragedy is that in war, innocent people die, and it's so difficult to see innocents who are dying. And also, I don't know, but in Israel, every time a soldier is killed, it's a trauma for the country. So they've lost so far over 500 IDF soldiers since October 7th. And I think it's something like 187 in Gaza itself. Ever since the formation of the State of Israel, they, if you like, have been in a state of war because they're surrounded by enemies. Over the years, there have been peace agreements, but I feel and agree with Israel that I feel that they feel that they cannot live alongside an army of people that just wants to kill and murder them. And I think the saddest thing for me is that those that they slaughtered on that day in October 7th were people that were reaching out to them and were allowing Palestinians to come and work in the kibbutzes, and they were taking Palestinians from Gaza to the hospitals in Israel for treatment, and really doing good work to try and foster good relationships with people from Gaza. And that was totally annihilated and destroyed on October 7th. Yes, I mean, I'm in the UK and I just see and hear the media, which is, I'm afraid, has a tendency to be very biased and very little mention of the hostages. I'd like to praise the Daily Mail because I did actually see an article where they did actually have pictures of 4 girl hostages that are still being held, and just appealing really for governments to put pressure. So, but I see it also biblically.
Yeah.
That these things are prophesied, and Israel has to go through some terrible times, and has been, a Jewish nation has been through some terrible times. And I pray that God's purposes would be fulfilled, because he has promised in his word that the Jewish people would come back to the land. And I wonder if the rising anti-Semitism around the world would actually cause a flood of refugees, Jewish refugees, coming back to the land of Israel. I don't know, but I know that talking to Jewish people in the UK, many of them feel that they, not so much for them, but for their children, they don't feel they have a future in the UK, which is very sad to hear, but that's how they're feeling at the moment. There's a lot of fear in the Jewish community in the UK. Yes. Okay.
Well, Tamar, thank you very much for sharing about the history that you've been studying over the years. It's been great for you to be with us today.
Thank you.
And the contact information for Repairing the Breach is repairingthebreach2018 at gmail.com.